Spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sed sapientiae,
Ora pro nobis.
in mane Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Right. So, when we're talking about the foundation of France, what was usually seen as the founding moment of France, which is the baptism of Clovis. Remember that on the occasion of his winning a victory, as Clovis winning victory against the some other tribes that had invaded, we still might call Gaul at this point, what had been at any rate the Roman province of Gaul. He won the battle, which was clearly due to divine intervention when he was not doing so well. And at that point, effectively vowed, in some sense, to embrace the faith, receive baptism, and embrace the faith if he would survive the battle. And they did. Not only did they survive, but in fact emerged victorious. And so, after that, as we said, the baptismal font of St. Martin's, the great church of Reims, we'll go with the English pronunciation of that, were magnificently adorned. The nave was decorated with white hangings. The same emblematic color also appeared in the dress of Clovis and the other catechumens chosen from among the flower of the Salians. So, of course, white is just the usual color of the baptismal robe. That's why you have, I mentioned that earlier, that his firstborn son, who died after receiving baptism, which was part of the reason why Clovis was upset because of that. He imagined there was some connection between the baptism of his first son and the death of that child, that he initially did not embrace the faith before this point, or he may have considered it true, but certainly did not undergo baptism before that point, or embrace the practice of the faith, because he was upset at that fact. In any case, I mentioned earlier that this child died whilst yet in his baptismal robe. That's something that was done in the early centuries of the church, that after receiving baptism, those who were baptized would remain in their white baptismal garments for at least a week afterwards. That's why you have mention of Low Sunday, which is the Sunday immediately following Easter, Dominica in Albis. That refers to the fact that was the final day in which the neophytes, those who were newly baptized, were still wearing their white baptismal robes. And that's also the reason why Pentecost Sunday is sometimes referred to as a Whit Sunday. You don't hear it referred to it too much as that anymore, but in older books you might see mention of Whit Sunday. Actually, even it's not even, doesn't have to be that old. The book doesn't have to be that old to be referred to as that. You can find that in different editions of Fortescue's work, Adrian Fortescue's rubrical work, The Ceremonies of the Roman Rite Described. You have mentioned, and that was the first edition of that, came out in 1917, if I remember correctly. It was subsequently revised multiple times, but in that book, you see mention of the ceremonies for Whitsun Eve, meaning the Vigil of Pentecost. And the reason for that was because, just as on the Vigil of Easter, day on which baptism was traditionally administered to converts, infants as well, of course, but traditionally that was the day on which converts were baptized. Keep in mind that the Easter Vigil used to go all night long, so there was plenty of time. People would show up at the church Holy Saturday evening, and there would be all night long, there would be ceremonies, of a whole range of ceremonies, yes, singing of prophecies, and of course the blessing of the Easter fire, but also the singing of prophecies in both Latin and Greek. There would be ordinations, confirmations, baptisms, everything, all of that going all night long until the early morning hours of Easter Sunday. The first Mass of Easter would be celebrated. So you can see in the traditional we're talking pre-1955 Holy Week ceremonies, you can see how all of that is still there. All those elements are still there, condensed, made shorter. Well, they actually can be stretched out over time if you add enough ceremonies to it. If you actually do ordinations during that, or confirmations, if you were to add that, it would definitely take, if we were to start in the evening, it would take all night long. Most definitely. You can easily see how that could be expanded into that. So you still see all those elements are still there. and so meaning that baptisms were done on the vigil of Easter, that all-night vigil. And keep in mind there was a similar vigil for Pentecost, which to this day is of equal rank with Easter in the hierarchy of the feasts of the church. So there was, and there still are traditionally, if you follow the traditional pre-55 ceremonies generally the way we do, there still is a vigil of Pentecost ceremony, during which also the baptismal font is in principle to be blessed, just as it is on the vigil of Easter, also in principle for baptisms to be conferred during the Pentecost vigil. So that means, once again, that any neophytes, any newly baptized who had been baptized during the Pentecost vigil were most certainly still wearing their white garments on Pentecost Sunday itself, so that the name, despite the fact that on Pentecost the color of the vestments is red, still you have the label Whit Sunday, the Sunday in which everybody's wearing white. Of course, it was not the only Sunday in which that was done, but it was yet another Sunday on which the newly baptized were wearing white, and therefore called Whit Sun, White Sun meaning White Sunday, Sunday in which they were wearing their white baptismal garments. And of course, the white baptismal garment that is still in fact used in the ceremonies of the church, it's not worn all week long. It's not worn throughout the entire octave of Easter or Pentecost or for any day or just for a week after anybody is baptized, but it is still used in the ceremonies of the church. In the case of an infant, it usually takes the form of a purificator placed on the child, because the fact that it's a little bit difficult it would be difficult to put that something like a white garment on a baby during the ceremonies. Babies are obviously they are in constant need of being held so that their heads don't fall back. So it would be a little bit difficult to get that onto a child in the middle of a ceremony with no place to put the child down. But that usually takes the form of a purificator that the minister of baptism simply places on the child, on the head of the child. But it's still used, and when it comes to adult baptisms, you do actually typically take a white garment. We had one before moving on. I'm not sure if it remained with us here, but you do, in principle, an adult who has just been baptized put on the white garment. They take it off after the ceremony is over, but still, there's still that symbolic conferral of the white garment, which is meant, of course, to symbolize their soul, which has just been, or the soul of the person baptized, or the souls of the person who's just baptized. The fact that soul or souls, as the case might be, are now immaculately clean from sin. So that's one reason why they're wearing white. It may well be because of this that white ended up being a color that was symbolic of the French monarchy. So the color white became a symbol, as I understand, of the monarch, the French monarch himself. And so later on in the Revolution, the colors red, white, and blue were all symbols traditionally used by France, but not in that way. They were not all put together like that before the Revolution, but they were used for various different things. One of them was, yes, the symbolizing the monarch. The other, I forget what the other two were exactly, but one of them, as I recall, was symbolizing the city of Paris itself. I'm not sure which one, but that's something I'd have to brush up on the details of. But the point is, those are all colors that were traditionally used by France, but the forging of the tricolor was unquestionably a revolutionary production. That was a revolution. That was something put forward by the revolution. So that is to be kept in mind. And remember, that is the reason why in the 19th century, the Count de Chambord, who may well have ended up as a Catholic king of France, did not, because he refused to accept the tricolor. One of the other claimants, there were three claimants: the Bonapartists, the Bourbon claimant, and I forget the third one at this point. But there were three claimants, and the Count de Chambord may well have ended up as the king, except for the fact that he would not accept the tricolor. So, to his credit, it's not something you want to accept. It is, without a question, a symbol of the revolution. Of course, nowadays, most people just see it as a symbol of France, the triple-colored flag. But it was most definitely, certainly at that time, there was... everybody was seen as a symbol of revolution. Probably most people don't think about it, but French traditional Catholics to this day, it was certainly wanting nothing to do with it. So that's about the French tricolor. And also, no doubt, they were happy. We'll put it this way: they were probably not too upset about the parallels with, of course, the American flag, which was still a relatively new thing at the time as well, because all of the principles that were employed in the American Revolution, that was just the trial run, so to speak, for the French Revolution. It was all the exact same principles that were all implemented in both revolutions. It's just that they, in the French Revolution, they were taken to their ultimate conclusions. So much so that it actually horrified the American revolutionaries. I mean, George Washington, as first president of the United States, who was obviously very much a leader, himself a Freemason, no prize at all, a leader of the revolution, not really much of a general either, but that's a whole other story. He refused to see the ambassador that revolutionary, at least one of the many revolutionary French governments sent to him. He said essentially, he was horrified for one thing that they chopped off the head of Louis XVI. That was far too much, far too fast for him. And he said essentially to the ambassador whom they sent, he said essentially, get lost. We made an agreement with the French monarchy, not with you, rabble, we'll say. So I mean, George Washington, no prize, but there were definitely people who even were infected with all those same principles who were horrified at just how bad the revolution was in France. That's just something you understand about the French. They do nothing by halves. They see a principle, they will take it to its ultimate conclusions right away. I mean, if there's a good principles, that's a good thing. If there's a bad principles, as they were in the case of the revolution, it means they chop off the head of the king and start a republic that is the most leftist of all republics. As was the case of the French Third Republic. One of the worst versions of France ever was the Third Republic. And whether the absolute worst, up for debate. There have been plenty of horrible governments, but that was the longest lasting and persecuted the church terribly. So in any case, all this, Clovis said the French very much looked to the baptism of Clovis as the founding of the nation of France, which notice was founded, of course, as a Catholic nation. So on Christmas night of 496, all the streets were tapestried from the king's palace to the basilica. Notice we're calling him the king at this point. The church blazed with 1,000 fires shed from richly perfumed tapers. The procession moved on towards the basilica, preceded by the cross and the book of Gospels borne in state. Saint Remigius, remember Saint Remy, that's what the French did with that name, led the king by the hand. They were followed by Queen Clotilda, who remember is already a Catholic, and the two princesses. So we have here Albufleda and Lantilda, sisters of Clovis, or those great Frankish names. Sure sound like tribal names. Upward of 3,000 officers and nobles of the court, all dressed in white ornaments, were going to receive baptism with their king. So notice that this is considered perfectly normal, that everybody should be of the same religion. That's assuming that we're talking about the Catholic faith. That is, in fact, does make perfect sense that everybody should be of the same religion as the monarch. Unfortunately, that principle has been misunderstood, misapplied in many different scenarios throughout the history of the world. It's the reason why the church was persecuted by the Roman Empire. It was not that the pagan Romans had a problem with accepting Christ as some kind of a deity. They didn't have so much a problem with that. But what they objected to was the fact, remember, that the Catholic Church claimed to be the one and only religion, and their God was the one and only God. That the Romans accepted all kinds of other pretended fake deities into their pantheon as far as they didn't distinguish between Christ and any other entity that we'll say that they allowed into their deity, into their pantheon. So they saw that as a defiance of their state religion. You cannot be of a different religion from the national ruler, who in that case was the emperor, whom they saw as a god. And so that was that principle that without religious unity there can be no national unity is true. It's just that you have to have actual religious unity, which means practice the one and only divinely revealed religion in order to have that true religious unity. To actually have unity of faith means to be united through adherence to the Catholic faith. That's what unity of faith means. So also on that principle, notice that nobody accepts today, nobody accepts Bergoglio as the rule of faith. But everybody who actually has the Catholic faith rejects many things that he teaches. And people who follow what he says, even if they might have a certain unity in some sense, that's not unity of faith because they don't have the faith. So some people like to try to object that because of universal peaceful acceptance that Bergoglio must be the Pope. That does not apply to Novus Ordo hopes. They do not have actual universal peaceful acceptance, despite whatever appearances there might be, because for one thing, nobody actually accepts him as the living rule of faith, for reasons we said. So that's a whole other, we're not going to need to go into the whole discussion of that right now. It is in fact true that authors are very, very strong on that. That it is, if the entire church, morally speaking, universally, peacefully accepts a man as pope, that is an infallible guarantee that that man actually is the pope. Some even go so far as to say that it's an infallible guarantee that he was actually validly baptized and validly ordained. I might even say validly consecrated a bishop. And that authors are very, very strong on that. And which I actually correctly understanding all the premises that they put forth for that conclusion, that is true. It's just that you have to understand those principles correctly, those arguments correctly, and they do not apply to Bergoglio. But that's we will not go into all of that right now. So, 3,000 officers and nobles of the court, all dressed in white ornaments, were going to receive baptism with their king, which notice they probably wouldn't have done had he not embraced the faith himself, received baptism. So, standing before the font, the king begged the grace of regeneration in the saving water of baptism. Having made him profess his belief in the Holy Trinity, he baptized him and anointed him with holy chrism. So notice that these ceremonies of baptism, whatever they may have been at the time, those are things that can change with over the centuries in the discipline of the church, what exactly is involved in the ceremonies of baptism. Notice that there was always some form of that professing the faith before receiving baptism. Of course, when you're actually bringing someone through these ceremonies of baptism, it should be purely ceremonial in the sense of putting the rubber stamp on what we already know. It is still official. It's not meaningless. We're not saying that it's meaningless, that the ceremonies of baptism in which the person about to be baptized professes the faith, or the ceremony, or in the ordination ceremony when the bishop exhorts the ordinants to keep in mind what their obligations are and making sure there are no objections on it. It's not saying that all that is meaningless when we say it's purely ceremonial, but that should just be making official what we already know. And so at this point, notice this was always done. That catechumens had to, let's say those about to receive the faith, about to receive baptism, that they all had to make clear their adherence to the faith. That has always been true. So I made him profess his belief in the Holy Trinity. He baptized him and anointed him with holy chrism, and that is still done. Notice all these ceremonies of the church are all still applied. We study the conferral of the sacraments in our course on the ceremonies of the ritual. You see that all of these elements are still there. The church never really throws anything out, so to speak. Everything is retained in some form, even if it's a very abbreviated form. We're talking about the Easter Vigil. The ceremonies as we have them today, they can be done in a matter of, if it's a low ceremony, it could be done in, say, 2.5 hours. That's obviously much shorter by many hours than the ancient Easter Vigil ceremonies, but all the elements are still there in some form. You don't do any ordinations or confirmations or baptisms. There's still room for all of that. It could be expanded into that. And also, of course, so the Easter Vigil, you have Vespers. For the Easter Vigil, not for Pentecost, but for the Easter Vigil, you have Vespers tacked on to the end as well. That's a more recent addition to those ceremonies. But even so, you see all those elements. The ceremonies as they are today, today meaning according to the 355 ceremonies, those are all ancient elements, very ancient elements. There are many signs of that during Holy Week, of just how ancient the traditional ceremonies are. For example, during the office, anybody who has to say the office knows very well that the pattern of matins, for example, the opening invitatory psalm, invitatory and invitatory psalm, the hymn at the beginning, all of the absolutions, blessings, the Te Deum, which occurs all the time, there are none of those elements are there. There's not even a hint of any of that. It's because that's how ancient the office of specifically of the Triduum is. We're talking here about Tenebrae. That's how ancient it is. It's before all those other elements were later added. It's in a sense a very stark version of the office. It's definitely the Roman office, unmistakably the Roman divine office, but it's a very stark version of it, which no doubt was stark during Holy Week always for other reasons. The reasons that still obtain, or reasons that obtain then and obtain now, but the idea is it was purposely kept that way in its most ancient form because of the starkness of those days. And it's everything about it is perfectly toned for the somber nature of the Triduum. So, 3,000 officers and soldiers who accompanied him, besides a great number of women and children, were then baptized by the attendant bishops and other clergy. Albofleda received baptism, and then Tilda, who was already a Christian but had fallen to Arianism, was reconciled to the church and received the unction of Holy Chrism. So, did some form of making an abjuration, in other words, of Arianism. Keep in mind that it is abjuration of error and profession of faith. Sometimes people get those mixed up. You don't abjure the faith on that occasion. That means abjure something means to give it up. The abjuration of error, of any kind of error and profession of faith. That's what. So this is all still around. The church still requires this of heretics who quit their heresy and join the church. They have to clearly profess that they have abandoned their errors and have embraced the faith. So Clovis, unwilling to see the rejoicings of so happy a night marred by the tears of the unfortunate, ordered the release of all captives and made costly offerings to the churches. The Christmas night, which lighted the birth of the Franks to the true faith, has always been dear to France as a family festival. So Noël was ever the cheer and the battle cry of our fathers. Dara speaking as a Frenchman when he says that. And so yes, most definitely this is our reason anyway why Christmas is so important to feast in France. So this is really considered to be not only the baptism of Clovis, but also many of his people, but also of the nation of France. So if we have seemed to dwell upon this event with, he says, some complacency, it is because of a natural sentiment which must be readily understood. So, well, yes, that's actually understandable in this case. Besides, at the time of its occurrence, it was hailed with joy by the whole Catholic world. So this really is we wouldn't say the birth necessarily of the first Catholic nation. That you could arguably say that was the Roman Empire when it converted, became a Catholic nation, once everything was properly ordered. But this definitely is the birth of the first Catholic nation of Western Europe, of which there were, of course, several. So Pope Anastasius II was particularly particularly made glad at this conversion, as he hoped to find in Clovis a powerful champion of the Church. He was then, in fact, the only truly Catholic sovereign, because the emperor, not to be confused with Pope Anastasius II, but the Emperor Anastasius in the East was given up to Eutychianism, so he was a Monophysite still. Theodoric in Italy, Alaric II, king of the Visigoths, in Spain and Aquitania, Gundobald, king of the Burgundians in Gaul, Thrasimund, king of the Vandals in Africa, were all Arians. So notice that these barbarian tribes are mostly heretics at this point, and would remain so for a while, actually, because the Eastern Roman Empire is still around. It would be around for another 1,000 years or so after this, but it was nothing compared to what the Roman Empire used to be. It was just a spot of corruption in the East. They did have something of a resurgence in the next couple of centuries. We'll see that. It's very interesting, actually. The Emperor Justinian, who ruled from Constantinople as Eastern Roman Empire, and his famous general Belisarius, they did a great deal towards rebuilding the power of the Eastern Roman Empire. Actually, Belisarius waged campaigns in North Africa and Italy, the idea was to restore the empire in the West. To some extent, they were not looking to take over France, certainly not, but They were definitely looking to reestablish, to regain control of lands that really they were always claimed by Constantinople. I mean, Constantinople definitely saw itself as the capital of the Roman Empire, which is still around, even if they did next to nothing for the most part, with few exceptions, to actually do anything to hold together the empire in other areas. And they would fight. They would, later on in later centuries, Belisarius would wage wars against other Vandal kings who were also Arians. So it would take a long time for these tribes to give up the heresies that they had adopted. So notice that all of these tribes are all the Visigoths, the Burgundians, the Vandals. They're all overrunning the tribes that had lived in those areas in the Roman provinces. So things were in all these newer tribes, so to speak, coming in, absorbing the ones that were already there, absorbing any Roman population that was left foraging what we know as the nations of Western Europe. So the Pope wrote to Clovis in these words: "We congratulate you that your conversion to the Catholic faith is simultaneous with our promotion to the pontificate. Can the chair of St. Peter be insensible to a feeling of joy that the nations are now gathering under its shadow, when it sees the net which the fisher of men has been ordered to cast into the sea of the world, filling up through the flow of ages?" In other words, it is in fact, we don't have to go through this entire letter here, but in other words, it is in fact a very good thing that church and state are united. This is a very good thing to see the birth of a Catholic nation. And keep in mind, to this day, in nations of Western Europe, there still is a certain union of church and state. It's not an ordered situation in those countries, don't get me wrong here, but they definitely, there is no complete separation of church and state as there is in this country. That is also a disordered situation, but in a way it's better than even what existed in Western Europe, and I say only in a way, because that what union of church and state there still exists in those nations of Western Europe, it just exists enough to allow the state to cause the church trouble. That's about it. And they might support the Novus Ordo at this point to some extent, but that actually causes problems in the traditional movement in some countries, because there's still this notion of, well, people don't think they have to support the church much, when in fact they do, and traditional Catholic clergy might be entirely reliant upon donations of the faithful to survive. But there still is this notion that people in fact don't give much, because they have this notion about the state supports the church. We don't have to do too much. Whereas that is, they might give something, they might be giving stuff to the Novus Ordo, that's possible, but definitely not to traditional Catholics. Yeah, the traditional movement has always been, relatively speaking, very small, obviously. Even taking into account the largest groups, even if you have existed, if you consider SSPX, the traitors that they are, in fact, leading people straight in who want to practice the faith straight back into the Novus Ordo. Even if you include them, even that group, even they are, all things considered, very small. Just large enough to actually get the attention of the Novus Ordo higher-ups, but objectively still quite small. And so these governments generally have never taken much notice of the traditional movement. At least not much. Maybe some in some cases, but not much. For example, there's no way that we could ever have priests be military chaplains, for example, because there are Novus Ordo military chaplains. One actually contacted us some time ago. We haven't heard anything since, but they do exist. The point is they do exist, but it's because the Novus Ordo has a whole arrangement with the U.S. government and the U.S. military to provide chaplains, and to be part of that, we would have to be part of the Novus Ordo organization that organizes all of that, and that definitely we would never do. And they wouldn't recognize us specifically because as some other Catholic entity, as they would see it, because then they would have to recognize all kinds of other smaller entities. So it's just it was never really a dream job in any case. Traditionally, that's saying in past times, military chaplains, it's a bit of a strange thing, because in itself that's entirely worthy apostolate to be a chaplain for the military, but for whatever reason in the past, I guess it was always an undesirable job, because it was usually, I'll say, not exactly the cream of the clergy who were typically sent to be military chaplains. a place to get rid of troublemakers, send the problematic priests who aren't so problematic as to be reduced to the lay state or suspended or anything like that, but who are still troublesome in some way, send them to be military chaplains and get them out of the way in that manner. That's typically what would happen. Unfortunately, because in itself there's nothing wrong with that. But the point being, we can't, even if there were an outcry for it, we'd be probably incapable of actually sending any chaplains to the military. So the Pope wrote to Clovis in these words. Okay, we read that. Okay, so yes, for example, in Italy, the state, the Italian government still does recognize the Catholic Church. Of course, they're looking at the Novus Ordo when they talk about the Catholic Church, meaning that the Italian Institute, they still have to pay certain taxes. They're not tax exempt. I think the Italian government probably does consider the Catholic Church tax exempt, but I don't know what their laws are or to what extent or anything under any of the particulars. But the point is that they cannot, I'm not sure how they deal with all the laws there, but they cannot take advantage of any kind of tax breaks that the Italian government might afford the church, because they would have to register some kind of a Novus Ordo organization. They would have to be considered part of the Novus Ordo, and of course they're not willing to be part of that. They cannot do that. There's an obligation. They're correctly assessing in that case their obligations to profess the faith. Not just to adhere to it, but actually to profess it. So they still, whatever they register as, they still have to pay taxes. So at least in this country, at least for now, the laws are such that allow traditional Catholic apostolates to be exempt from taxes, but that could change in the future. You never know. Also, for example, in Germany, I think there are special taxes laid down upon those who are registered as Catholics, and the state takes care to recognize apparently everybody's religion. Whatever religion anybody puts down, they have to identify as something to the state, and there are some kinds of taxes that come down on anybody who's registered as a Catholic. So I've heard stories of people who sometimes they'll still continue practicing the faith, consider themselves Catholics, but who will tell the state that they're not Catholics anymore, that they've left the church because they want to get out of those taxes or whatever other burdens that the state puts down. Now, that is not morally permissible. That's offensive. That's contrary to the obligation to profess the faith. And if we have to pay taxes, I mean, that could happen anywhere potentially. But if you have to pay extra taxes or something because you're registered as a Catholic, then, well, that might be a form of persecution, but that's a relatively mild one. And in fact, there is an obligation to undergo that. So, may Almighty God ever shower down his heavenly blessings upon your person and kingdom. May he give charge to his angels to keep you in all your ways and ever crown your arms with victory. So St. Avitus, Bishop of Vienne, although a subject of Gundobald, also writes to congratulate Clovis on his conversion, so we don't need to read the whole of his letter, but suffice it to say, everybody is very happy to see the birth of the first Catholic nation. So, the hopes expressed by St. Anastasius II and St. Avitus of Vienna were not deceived. And as Badara says, from the days of Charles Martel to our own, the Church has ever safely leaned upon the sword of France. That is definitely not 100% true. Largely, sure, throughout history, no doubt, but definitely not always, not by any stretch of the imagination. This is definitely an exaggeration coming from a Frenchman here. Charles Martel, yes, who famously defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours. Yes, he certainly defended the faith, but not always. And keep in mind, Dars is writing after the revolution, after all of the wars of Napoleon, who was a complete revolutionary, was just a leftist monarch at the time, essentially. Definitely, the Church has not always safely relied upon France as a protective entity, not by any means. So that's the revolution. We don't even describe that. That's for another section of church history, all the horrors of that. But also Napoleon, Napoleon at least figured out that he couldn't, no bloody persecution anyway. He figured out at least that much, that was a very bad idea, that he needed to have the church on board, needed to have in the enormous Catholic population in his kingdom and his empire, as he saw it, on his side if he was going to be any kind of a functional ruler. He still did persecute the church. Let's not make any mistakes on that. Just he was smart enough to figure out that bloody persecution is not the way to go. So remember, he came up, actually, Napoleon. He was thoroughly revolutionary. He came up. He had his initial. He earned his first battlefield spurs, so to speak, fighting those who were fighting against the revolution. He was involved in the siege of Toulon, where which was a city that tried to fight back against the revolution, was refusing to go along with it, and the British actually sent a fleet to their aid, and Napoleon was he was because of him, not entirely, then very largely, it was because of him that uprising failed. Well, but it was the French government, the French revolutionary government, was definitely not a legitimate government at the time. But even the British, they were not a Catholic nation, definitely not. They saw that this revolution is going just way too far. They had their own revolution, but it was done in a much more, I'll say, proper English fashion, where that's another thing to understand, is that every nation has its own characteristics, and the characteristic of the English is everything has to be nice and polite, even if it's horrible. Even if it's the principles of the revolution being employed, it still has to be nice and polite. You can't go and just line people up in front of a guillotine and chop their heads off. That's a little too much. They can do all kinds of horrible things, but it can't be quite so overt as that. So that's just how they are. Everything has to be nice and polite. Whatever it is, always has to have that exterior, some aspect of refinement to it. The French sometimes throw that out completely. They definitely have a refined side to them, no doubt, but they also still have clearly a savage side that has to be recognized. And to this day, they can go from very nice to completely savage on a dime. It's just how it is. They could be talking to you nicely one second and then metaphorically ripping your head off the next, verbally. Just the way they are. Don't be surprised if it happens to you someday. It could happen. So there's still some ancient Gallic blood left in them, clearly. Or maybe Frankish too. Probably it's a combination of all these things. The blood of the man who took his axe and split the soldier's head. Remember, because his weapons were into. That was Clovis himself who did that before his baptism. Remember that blood is still in their veins, clearly. So definitely the church has not always safely leaned upon the sword of France. That is an exaggeration. In many circumstances, sure. I mean, the French contributed in a major fashion to the Crusades. No doubt of that. For example, France has waged war against heretics within her own borders, famously against the Albigensians. That was a full-blown war effort against heretics there in the south of France. So that's also for other sections of church history. We'll get to that. So from such a page, it is painful to turn again toward the east, still a prey to lamentable dissensions. So remember, we are still centuries away from the schism of Photius, and even more centuries away from the final schism, or I consider final one that endures to this day, of Michael Cerularius. That's a mouthful, that name. But even so, at this point, the Greek Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, whatever you want to call it, is effectively in schism. So that it was schism on and off, heresies constantly coming, more or less constantly. If you notice this, fewer and fewer saints being produced. Previously, we had prominent saints in the East, no doubt. The East produced many, clearly still produce people with eminent sanctity, no question, who are revered by the church down the centuries, who have been revered by the church down the centuries, who are revered by the church to this day as being not only eminent for sanctity, but also for their learning. Like I said, all the doctors of the church are among those Eastern saints. But notice, don't see any of those names coming up anymore. The East has stopped producing saints and has just increased its production of heresy and schism to a higher and higher degree. So the fact that this later on becomes permanent is really no surprise. Highly unfortunate, never any the less tragic, considering the harm that does to souls, but also not exactly unexpected. It was not something that just happened without warning for the first time overnight, when that finally, either case of Photius or any other schism down the line that was more permanent. None of that is any surprise. So Pope Anastasius II had availed himself of the occasion offered by Theodoric's embassy to Constantinople to send to the east 2 legates, the bishops Cresconius and Germanus. Their mission was to make new efforts to obtain from the Emperor Anastasius the removal from the diptychs of the names of Acacius and Peter Mungus. Remember, Peter Mungus was an intruder, and a bishop who was just completely intruded himself into his episcopal see in the east, and Acacius had been at one time legitimate bishop of Constantinople, had seemed to be pretty good at one point, but had gone completely off the rails and had been deposed by the Pope. And notice how important this is. You have the Pope availing himself of a Gothic ruler's embassy to send legates, papal legates, to negotiate on the Pope's behalf for the removal of these names from the diptychs. And again, consider how that applies to the Unicum Mess. If it's important, it's important to remove the names of fake bishops, intruder bishops, fake in the sense of not having power of jurisdiction. They may have been validly consecrated bishops, but they were not legitimate in the sense of not having the power to actually rule over the sees that they were trying to rule. Because all of that, once again, is for the Pope to decide. If he says this man is a bishop of the see, he is. End of story. If he says no, he's not, he is not. It really is as simple as that. Whatever time in the history of the church you might read about somebody else actually immediately installing someone into a see, that may have happened, that's because the Pope allows that. That's still with his permission and with his authorization, ultimately authorized by him. Having, as he does, the power of Christ to be invested with Christ immediately with the power to rule the church. So their mission was to, as we said, make new efforts to obtain the removal of those names from the diptychs, and the diptychs were the places wherein the names of those to be mentioned in the sacred liturgy were written. So you apply that to the Unicum Mess. They were also to demand the recognition of the Council of Chalcedon and consequently the extinction of the schism. So remember, some time ago, the Emperor Zeno had said, put down his Henoticon, which did not seem to contain anything explicitly heretical, but was offensive in as much as it did not take into account the Council of Chalcedon, wherein, of course, monophysitism was condemned. So keep that in mind, if I recall correctly. In any case, so again, yes, to take into account the Council of Chalcedon and the extinction of the schism. So that was, remember, the Henoticon was Zeno's decree of union, or supposed anyway. All it did was cause trouble, but it was a case of the emperor overstepping his bounds, of a civil ruler, not the most powerful one at this point, but a civil ruler well overstepping his bounds. So the arrival of the Pope's legates in the east caused a deep sensation. 2 priests of the Church of Alexandria were sent to Constantinople to work together for the reconciliation of the See of St. Mark with the Apostolic See. So yes, Alexandria was a place where actually the body of St. Mark was kept for a time. Now it's in Venice, but St. Mark is considered to have ruled over that, and he is now his body is now in Venice, though. The legates were charged to lay before the Pope the profession of faith of the Alexandrian clergy. Even Macedonius, Patriarch of Jerusalem, seemed disposed to do his share on bringing about a lasting reconciliation. So these are cases, we mentioned of the Patriarch of Jerusalem. If he's in schism, he is not actually the legitimate bishop of that. In any case, Patriarch is a title that only exists because the Pope allows it to exist. And it doesn't, the Pope could confer special privileges on a bishop or on a see whose bishop has the title of patriarch, but ultimately all of that is for the Pope to decide. So this is a case in which probably formerly schismatic bishops would just be confirmed by the Pope, because he can confirm whomever he wants. He could also tell anybody he wants, you are not allowed to function, you're not allowed to exercise orders that you received in schism, or after having gone into schism, you are no longer to function as a cleric. Could do that too. He could do whatever he wants, according to the dictates of prudence. So he wished to send to the Roman pontiff synodal letters stating the grounds of future negotiations. But all these brightening hopes were crushed by the unbending obstinacy of the emperor Anastasius, who opposed the desire of Macedonius and forbade him on pain of exile to hold any communication with the Holy See. Not wishing, he said, to hear of any accommodation unless the Pope consented to sign the Henoticon, which was precisely that decree of union, with that in quotes, that was the very cause of trouble to begin with, dating back all the way to the Emperor Zeno, who way overstepped his bounds in decreeing everybody has to agree to this. So some historians assert that it was his aim to ensnare the Roman pontiff and to bring him, by insidious wiles and promises, to betray the cause of God and of truth. He little knew the unfailing firmness of the chair of Peter, against which the gates of hell shall never prevail. Still less was he acquainted with the noble character of Anastasius II, Saint Anastasius, I'm talking about the Pope, its occupant. So when the legates returned to Rome, the pious pontiff was no more. He had gone to his reward on the 16th of November of 498. So they came back really empty-handed, the legates in this case, but at least they didn't betray the trust that had been given to them. We've seen before there were legates who had definitely done exactly that, had made concessions that they were not to have made, and which the Pope had to make clear were not to be. They had made concessions the Pope had made clear were not to be observed. This is invalid. They never intended to authorize this. Because keep in mind, generally speaking, when legates carry out some kind of negotiation in the name of the Pope, they might even preside over an ecumenical council, for example. And when they do, and everything is done correctly, and they might be the ones who immediately preside over it, even as it's promulgated, still it's all done with the authorization of the Pope. That at least he said, well, I want you to deal with these things, and what you decide is most definitely to be considered as coming from me. But he has to, in fact, intend at least that in many cases those legates had failed, and they said that they granted things that they were not supposed to grant, and the Pope never intended to authorize that. So that can happen too. In this case, they didn't do that. These legates did not betray their trust, but they did not, in fact, accomplish the mission that they had been sent to accomplish, due to really the obstinacy of the Eastern schismatics at this point. So having been consulted by the Catholics of Constantinople concerning the baptism administered by Acacius and his partisans, the Pope answered that the sacraments of baptism and orders conferred by a bishop who was excommunicated and suspended from ecclesiastical functions were still valid, and that those who had received the sacraments from them were not to be disturbed on that account. So this is referring to validity, not to lawfulness, because that's something that that's a fairly common misconception these days. If it's valid, that's good enough, and that is far from true. I mean, just a basic understanding of the moral theology concerning the sacraments makes that abundantly clear. That because any given Mass or the conferral of any sacrament might be valid, it certainly is not to be considered lawful on that account. There may still have been grave sin involved. In fact, that is, in principle, a very grave mortal sin to confer or receive sacraments in schism. It might be validly done, but it's not. All of that is to be ruled over by the Church, especially the Mass. The Mass is most definitely, I might say, a hierarchical function. It is a function really of the entire Church. It must be done in union with the entire Church. By which, of course, anybody who is in union with the Holy See is in union with the entire Church. So truly in union. So anybody who is baptism and orders conferred by a bishop who is excommunicated and suspended, obviously he's not supposed to be functioning. The authority of the Church has told him, you are suspended from your functions, you are actually cut off from membership in the Church, excommunication. And it's precisely that, as it is an act of jurisdiction severing somebody from membership in the Church. Maybe somebody who hasn't done anything, may not have done anything to merit the actually being severed from the Church automatically, but he has still done something terrible as a result of which he is to be cut off. Sometimes, even so, say someone who becomes a heretic, that's to say, starts professing heresy and joins a heretical sect, there might still be some sentence of excommunication laid down against him. That active jurisdiction can still take place even when someone does do something that automatically severs him from membership in the church in every sense. But even if not, you may have done something that, for example, someone may have just given some terrible scandal, and as a result of that, been excommunicated. The authority of the church can't do that. Right. Spiritus Sancti, men subtuum presidium confugimus Sanctae Genitrix, nostras supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sera periculis cunctis libera nos, semper glorios et benedicta. Amen. In pacis et filii et Spiritus Sancti.